G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video we're going to go through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We've got a lot to get through in this video, so I'll make it as efficient as possible. We'll jump firstly into my key deadline considerations for the race weekend, and there's a little bit to digest, particularly after the aftermath in Australia, where we had 6 DNFs, a number of highly owned drivers and even constructors went down in value and essentially put a lot of us fantasy managers on the back foot for this weekend. Now, for a lot of you that are in a situation where you're looking at a revised team value after Australia of around 98, 99 million or so, or even maybe less than that, because of these price drops, it means the wildcard certainly comes into play a lot earlier than many of us had probably anticipated. Now, with the new pricing model, which we will discuss in just a second, it becomes, with this 3-race rolling average, difficult to hold assets for longer periods of time, or at least justify owning them where they are on a downward trend for their price changes. Now, I think that the easiest way to go about it is for drivers that had DNFs in Australia, try and find alternative transfers available to pivot into those assets. Just simply because with the 3-race average, it's likely that these same DNF'd assets from Australia will drop again in China. The situation, I guess, around the wildcard specifically means that you've got a bit more flexibility to obviously make those decisions and transfers and move into those assets that had great races in Australia and are expected to continue to gain value over the next couple of weeks, assuming, again, no DNFs. The thing is, for those people that are less inclined to go down the wildcard route, and I kind of have a certain stance on approaching this kind of, let's call it wildcard or transfer situation, is if you're on the back foot and have, let's say, 4 assets or so that dropped in value after Australia, I think the wildcard certainly becomes a consideration. But if you're in a boat, and I'll bring this tweet up on the screen here, where perhaps you only have 3 or less that fell in value, 2 or less that fell in value, then perhaps you could consider limitless instead. Now, I'm not saying my team is going to be the same for every single one of yours, but I think to move off those poisonous assets, those bad eggs, with, I guess, a situation where you have dropped in price, or these assets have dropped in price, then the wildcard becomes a very easy tool to enable those moves. Whereas I think the limitless promotes a discussion around, if you've only got a couple of assets falling in price after Australia, then that becomes a certain option in China. I'm not saying it's one and the same for one situation and vice versa if you have bad versus good assets, but I think moving out, in essence, of those bad assets that are likely to go down in value again sets your team value up for a better position over future race weeks. I think in terms of prioritizing those assets, Oscar Piastri is a good example of that, who lost a number of positions when he spun out around lap 44 in Australia. Now, given he's in a better car, a better team, more likely to start further up the grid, more likely to score more points than a driver like Gabriel Bortoleto, Oscar Piastri for me isn't a priority transfer like some of the back markers for the likes of Doohan, Bortoleto, Isaac Hadjar, just simply because a back marker isn't going to be scoring 20 points to overcome that point scoring threshold needed for a price rise in future weeks. And we'll go on to, again, that kind of price metric or price model in just a second. But I do think because of those reprioritizations or certain urgent transfers needed, taking -10s becomes a serious consideration this weekend. I think obviously the wild card is right there if you're looking at -20s, -30s. But I think a -10 is more than fine if it means moving off an extra driver likely to go down in value in subsequent weeks. I think that, again, I hate the cliche, but it is team dependent. But if you think that making an additional move helps you to enable other transfers into your team that can promote a price increase across, the 2 or 3 assets that you're bringing in this weekend, then I think a -10 is perfectly fine. And then, as I said, Limitless becomes an option for teams that have, 5 or more assets that increased in value in Australia. Why do I say that? Because when you activate Limitless, you get the price changes of your pre-Limitless team. If you've watched my chip strategy video, I'll go through how that chip works in more detail. But ultimately, if you want to use Limitless this weekend or in future weekends, you want to have 5 or more assets that are going to appreciate in value, even if they have a mixed or middling result. And I think if you're on a team that has, Signs, Hadja, Duan, Bortoletto, etc., that's probably not a team I'd look to activate the Limitless chip on for this weekend. So some food for thought there, and I guess that segues nicely into how to unpack the scoring thresholds for price changes in the game this year. This is from the F1 Fantasy Tools Discord. Again, I've plugged that channel several times on the videos I've been posting here. But you'll see in this column, and for those of you unfamiliar with this scoring threshold, each asset, depending on what they're priced at, either above or below 20 million, will receive a price change at the end of the weekend based on how they score. So for example, if we take Max Verstappen, the second driver on the list here, for Max to go up 0.3 million in China, he needs to score greater than or equal to 6 points. If Max scores between -3 points and 5 points, he will go up 0.1 million. If he scores between -11 and -4 points, a poor performance by these metrics, he will go down 0.1 million. And if Max was to score less than or equal to -12 points, he would go down $0.3 million. So apply that methodology to any of the drivers in this table here. I guess the reason for including this in the video is that for wildcard teams and Limitless teams, as I've talked about, you want to target assets that don't have a high threshold to reach for them to go up in value again in China. So I'm looking at the wildcard teams specifically, people that are in a situation where they are on the back foot with team value. They might be, as I said, in the 96s to 98s, 99 millions even. Wildcarding into assets that have a low point scoring threshold are those most likely to appreciate in value again. And you want to be targeting, again, those assets under 20 million where possible to get that higher possibility of a $0.6 million boost. So I'm looking at someone like Kimi Antonelli. Needs to score more than or equal to -9 points to get a 0.6 million price rise. The only likelihood that Kimi doesn't get a $0.6 million price rise in a situation like this would be if he DNFs. Now, I think every driver does have a possibility of DNFs, some higher than others, but I think you obviously need to factor in, the probability of that happening based on the driver, the team, and their kind of experience and racecraft. You look at a driver, let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum, someone like Gabriel Bortoletto at the bottom here, where he has to score more than or equal to 25 points to get a $0.6 million increase. But if he scores less than or equal to 21 points, he goes down another 0.6 million. So I think someone like Bortoletto, Isaac Hadjar, less than or equal to 23 points, those two drivers are more than likely going to drop in price unless they have a 20 plus point performance in China. Look, it's a sprint race weekend. Drivers will score higher than usual, but I think more than 20 points for Duan, Hadjar, and Bortoletto is very much a very high outside chance of that happening. So if you own any of those 3 back markers, Duan, Hadjar, or Bortoletto, I'd very much make them your priority transfers for this week. And if you go down to the wildcard teams here, I've targeted for those teams on the back foot in the 96s to 99s, if you're choosing to go down that path, drivers that I think are bound to go up in price this time around in China. You've got McLaren and Williams. McLaren, they need to score greater than or equal to -34 points. So unless they double DNF or get disqualified, there's no way that they don't rise in price again. And then Williams only need to score more than 6 points to go up 0.6 million. So I think both of these, and Williams, given that Sainz DNF'd last week, I think he's on track to do much better this time around. So a 6 is not a high threshold for Williams to match. So I think given that Williams is a B tier asset under 20 million, I think they have a little bit of runway to rise this race. Going to the drivers, as I've talked about, Oscar Piastri only needs to score more than 18 points to go up 0.3 million, as he's more than 20 million. in price. And then you've got the likes of Stroll, Hulkenberg, and Ocon that don't really need to score much at all. Stroll and Hulkenberg just need to score a positive number, or not even that. They need to score more than -5, both of them, to go up 0.6 again. So I think Hulkenberg and Stroll, great budget building assets this weekend. Ocon as well needs to score more than 1 for another $0.6 million jump. And Tsunoda, probably a little bit more expected from him, the 11 points needed to go up the 0.6, but he scored plenty of those in F1 Fantasy. Double-digit hauls for Yuki is not outside the realms of possibility. So he's probably my pick of the bunch. If you're looking for a driver kind of a little further down the threshold, maybe Oliver Bearman only needs to score 6 points to obviously make that same jump. And then Albon, if you want to play around with the budget. Albon, Kimi Antonelli, obviously not in the wildcard teams on the bottom left, but I think they're also perfectly good assets for this weekend. On Limitless, it kind of goes without saying, because you're not getting the price increases, the tables above don't necessarily warrant as much consideration. You just want to be maximizing your points. So I think you're targeting McLaren triple up, and then one of either Mercedes or Ferrari, depending on who looks better in practice and sprint qualifying. Verstappen, obviously a fixture as the third driver, and then I'd probably go for Leclerc. I think Ferrari will be much better in China. And then again, depending on Mercedes or Ferrari in practice, I'd be going either Russell or Lewis Hamilton. So that's kind of my understanding of the pricing and scoring thresholds for this weekend. The numbers will naturally change each week, so just keep that in mind. These tables, these data points will change with each passing week as the average changes. But it is, I think, a pretty big consideration given that the scoring and pricing model this season is very different to how it has been in the past. Moving on to the asset tier ranking, kind of pulling that all together from the previous slide and what that means for our priority assets, our best assets this weekend in terms of points, in terms of budget gain, and what that means, I think, for maximizing your lineup and your transfers this week. I won't talk about every asset. I don't usually in this section, but I'll go through a couple. I think Lando, the best driver, most likely to go up in value again, simply just because, as we saw on the previous screen, does not need much at all to go up in value. In fact, he doesn't need anything. He just doesn't need to DNF. You can see Lando needs to score more than -23 to go up 0.3 million. But I think just because the only way to own Lando Norris is to own McLaren and Williams, I think that becomes a discussion if you're going down that path, or if you're choosing to go down a different premium constructor route. Oscar, I think, as I said, I really like. He can probably score more than 20 points in how good that McLaren's looking. I don't think that's impossible for him at all. And then I think I have Russell over Leclerc at the moment, but I think they are very much interchangeable. Russell, only because he had a much better race in Australia, doesn't need to score as much to rise again. And I think also because we've seen from him how good of a qualifier he was last year, only behind Max and Lando for third on the grid. So I think for that reason, unless we see a real drop-off in Mercedes' performance in free practice and sprint qualifying, I've got him above Charles. And then Max, again, tough just to accommodate because of his price. In the midfield, we've talked about these guys already, but Hulkenberg and Stroll should be priority transfers if you're on wildcard and looking to build value this weekend. I also really like Alex Albon as an alternative. He's now higher than Carlos Sainz. And then Kimi Antonelli kind of rounds out the other assets most likely to appreciate in value after China. Then going into the kind of the second half of the top 10, all of these guys are a bit of a crapshoot, a bit of a shot in the dark. Ocon, Bearman, Gasly, Tsunoda, all drivers that didn't DNF in Australia but didn't have great races. They don't need to score much this time around. On a sprint weekend, it's not going to be hard to rack up overtakes and positions gained. So that's why I like Ollie Bearman probably as the best of the back markers in the rookie class. And then further down the list, you've got obviously Sainz and Hadjar and Lawson and such that I just wouldn't really be considering this week in terms of growing your budget. Williams is really the only constructor I think I'd consider this weekend, but Haas, an alternative if you want to go differential. I'm not fully convinced they are for me right now. I think it's either McLaren Mercedes, Ferrari Mercedes, or McLaren Williams as the popular constructor pairings for China. Now, in terms of my final team thoughts for the weekend, my current choice for the 2X is Oscar Piastri. I can't see that changing heading into the deadline. Other candidates that other people are considering is George Russell after his great result in Australia, Lando Norris if you're going down that McLaren-Williams pairing we talked about, or Kimi Antonelli if you're not going for Piastri or Russell on wildcard, but you want to target those higher growth assets, and Kimi obviously as a B tier asset. He's only probably got a couple more races before he's in the A tier. So if he rises again in China, which seems likely, he's going to be very close to reaching that $20 million threshold. The chips in play we've talked about already, wildcard and limitless. I don't really think it's a weekend for any others. If there's a bit of rain, which, look, the forecast is saying there's rain expected after the Grand Prix on Sunday, so I don't think really no negative becomes that valuable compared to wildcard and limitless. But again, we saw the kind of chaos that unfolded in Australia. So just monitor the forecast with caution, but it's meant to be an uninterrupted weekend of weather with, again, as I said, a little bit of rain after the Grand Prix on Sunday. And for sprint race weekends, we need to consider obviously the fact that the deadline changes to the start of the sprint race on Saturday and not qualifying, which is later in the day on Saturday. So lock your teams in before the sprint race. We get free practice and sprint qualifying, both to obviously make our decisions and consider the performance of the different teams. But I think that just means, for those of you not familiar with the deadline, it is not sprint qualifying. The deadline is the sprint race on the Saturday. So I'm going to take you guys over to my team now, go through a couple of different builds for my F1 fantasy lineup for this weekend. For those of you that follow me on Twitter, you'll probably already know where my head is at for this weekend. So what I'm going to do is go through my two different options and then a couple of different combinations you guys could consider if you're on wildcard, as I talked about on the previous screen. So my first approach, or at least one of two options for this week, would be going into the McLaren constructor route instead of sticking with Ferrari. And I say that simply because McLaren are objectively right now the best team on the grid. The best driver pairing, Oscar and Lando, would have been on for a 1-2 had Oscar not spun out on lap 44 last week. Obviously, moving off Stroll does come with a degree of risk because he's likely to go up in value again. But McLaren's upside this weekend on a sprint weekend, I wouldn't be surprised if they break 100 points in F1 fantasy. Red Bull did that last year in China. McLaren have got really good strengths in the pits. Obviously, both drivers, great qualifiers and great races. So I do think having McLaren, Mercedes and Oscar to get to that by the second week of the season, I'm pretty happy if I choose to go down that route. Obviously, moving off Stroll would mean I can only get to Oliver Behrman with what I have available. Not obviously the worst situation in the world, but I am still left with Bortoleto and Hadjar. So I think I'm naturally having to eat a couple of extra price drops from these two guys. I think Behrman can certainly reach his price increase thresholds. Hulkenberg and Piastri, I think, can as well, as both of the constructors. But I think obviously having to offset that with two rookie drivers going to drop in price again is not an ideal situation. So I think going for a lineup like this for my team, I appreciate I got very lucky, and that's why my team value might be higher than some others, is probably chasing points instead of value. And we learnt last season how important team value is over the course of an entire year. So that's route number one. The other alternative would be, if I brought back Lance Stroll and plopped back in Ferrari, would just be to make one driver transfer, move out Isaac Hadjar. I think I can't unfortunately do Bortoleto. Or can I do Bortoleto? No, I can't. I can't do Bortoleto. So Ollie Behrman, again, just one transfer this week. I'd roll 3 into Japan, have 3 transfers. We've got an extra week of data to understand the price change likelihoods for the drivers and constructors. Having a bit more flexibility would mean I can chase a few extra transfers, and those assets likely to drop, to not drop. We don't want to chase assets that are dropping. Want to chase assets that are rising in value the following race. So they're the two approaches I've got. I'd be very surprised if my approach changes between now and the deadline, even from what we've seen in sprint qualifying, because I feel like I've got most bases covered at this point. But at this stage, that's kind of where I'm going. Now, we obviously talked about the different combinations to consider on like a wildcard build. So I think if I keep Hulk in here and move out some of these guys that are probably less likely to rise in value, and go towards one of the lineups I talked about before, which was the McLaren Williams. I think McLaren definitely will rise in value. Williams, I think, a very high chance as well to go up 0.6, and because they're, as I said, a B tier asset, they become an asset that has a lot of high growth potential in the price change department in the next few weeks. Hulk and Stroll keeping for obvious reasons, and then moving back into the drivers department. I had Yuki Tsunoda and I think it was Esteban Ocon, if I'm not mistaken. Where is the guy? Have I lost him? There he is. So I think that was one such lineup we could have for teams that are probably around that 97 to 98 million. And I think the other approach we could take here, if you were to not go down the Oscar Piastri route and you wanted to more aggressively target budget growth, which I think is perfectly fine. Again, at this point in the season, we've seen a lot of teams successfully do that in previous F1 fantasy seasons and finish, top 10, top 100, top 1,000 in the global leagues, is to put, instead of Oscar Piastri, Andrea Kimi Antonelli in the 2X slot. I myself, not quite sure I have the minerals to go with a rookie in my 2X, but again, if you want to take that risk, grow that budget, I think Kimi's perfectly fine. And if you were to move out Tsunoda instead, you'd have, or hopefully have enough to afford Alex Albon, who's now higher than Carlos Sainz. Do I think he should be? No, but he is based on this current pricing model. So those guys have had a $1.2 million swing, Albon going up 0.6, Sainz going down 0.6. And I think all of these drivers and constructors, for that matter, assuming no DNFs, should go up the maximum price increase in China. So I'm really liking this lineup for budget growth in the early goings of the season. But again, I'll be discussing all of these different combinations live on stream ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix deadline this coming weekend. The deadline is the start of the sprint race, as I've said, and not qualifying later in the day on Saturday. So I'll be live answering all of your questions. So please drop in, as the last deadline stream was a great success. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, if I don't see you before the end of the weekend, have a great rest of your weekend. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.